In today's gospel, we have the story of the man born blind. And one of the things that's interesting is that they wanted to know, well, who's the one who sinned? Was it him or his parents? And the one thing about it is that at the time, there was kind of this odd kind of a split. You certainly had the idea that at the resurrection that there were for many, but certainly not all, certainly not the Sadducees, and there were probably many others who believed that did not believe in the resurrection, but there were certainly many who believed that there would be this final call of the people at the end of time, and that God would separate the just from the unjust. But there was also that idea that you had from the idea of Sheol, that everybody goes down into the silence. So as God progressively kind of revealed and gone from that kind of an idea of everybody just kind of goes down into the silence, that all blessings and curses occur solely in this life. At the end of life is simply silence. You went from that to the idea of resurrection of the just at the end of time. But there is still this idea that blessings and curses occurred in this world. So they were wondering, well, who sinned? Obviously this was a very tough and very difficult situation for the person to be born blind. So who sinned? Was it him or his parents? And Jesus basically says, neither one. Don't worry about it. It's things happen within this world. And so in taking the man, what he does is that he takes the clay from the ground, and that kind of invokes one thing. It kind of invokes that idea of Genesis. We think about forming man from the dust and the clay of the ground, and that God formed man. So in a way, forming man in Genesis, in a way, reforming the human being in Christ. And then he sends him to the pool of Siloam. And that kind of invokes that idea of baptism. It kind of invokes that idea of the forgiveness of sins that we receive in baptism, whether it be personal sins if we're above the age of reason, but also of original sin. And so taking away the sin. And then they say, well, it kind of looks like him when he's able to see. They couldn't figure it out. Okay, here's this blind beggar, and he's now he looks different. But that kind of invokes that idea in 2 Corinthians 5:17, where those who are in Christ are a new creation. The old order has gone away, so they are different. Hopefully we are different when we're a Christian than the rest of the world. Certainly Israel was put to be Israel because it was to be a light to the nations. It was to be those people who were set apart. And so as the traders would come down from India and the Middle East and down into Egypt, they would see the wisdom, the beauty of God. And so certainly we're called to that as Christians. We're called to be a new creation as well, and that we are called to be different. And so they question the man. They say, how did this happen? And then they even ask his parents. And the parents say, he's basically of age, ask him. But they said that they were afraid that they would be thrown out of the synagogue. And, certainly at this time in Jesus' public ministry, being thrown out of the synagogue was highly unlikely. There were still people who were very, very much supportive of him. There were certainly a lot of people who were very curious of him. There were certainly a growing number, especially among the religious leaders, who were highly suspicious of him. But to be thrown out of the synagogue is really something that occurred during the time of John and the writing of the John's Gospel. Traditionally, the writing of John's Gospel was done sometime after the destruction of the temple, somewhere around the early 90s or thereabouts, maybe even a little bit earlier, but certainly for most people done after the destruction of the temple, when we see a great splitting off over time, that it's come to that point where either Jesus is the Messiah or he's not. And so there's been this split. So those who confess Jesus are basically asked to leave the synagogue. And then he becomes bolder. When his questioning becomes harsher, he becomes bolder. His faith becomes more alive. And so he basically tells them what had happened. But the people were saying, well, that can't be because it occurred on the Sabbath. And when we think about the Sabbath, especially in John's Gospel, is that the people were all upset because he was doing these healings on the Sabbath. He was doing miracles on the Sabbath. But really what we think about with the Sabbath is that the Sabbath was there for human beings. The Sabbath was a means of saying that you could only work X amount of time, because certainly those who had power, those who had money, those who had influence would certainly want people to work above and beyond what they were capable of doing. So they would have worked 12, 15 hours a day, 7 days a week if they could have. So God instituted the Sabbath as a means of taking the time off to be away from work, but also to worship God. But they were angry that it occurred on the Sabbath, so they threw him out. And then Jesus comes he sees him and he worships him. And so his faith has come for the point of, really, he didn't ask to be healed, but over time his faith gets stronger and now comes to worship him. And then, so those who were the religious leaders, those who physically could see, in the end became blind. But the man who was born blind physically was now able to see spiritually. He was able to see and to worship Jesus there, the one who made him whole, the one who gave him sight, the one who changed his life. And I think that that's really what we think about with the man born blind, is that idea of being the people that God is calling us to be, that God is making us into a new creation and to be that new creation. Thanks. God bless.